A few years ago, something truly strange happened to me that still puzzles me today. It all began when I was in my early 20s, living on a farm with my dad and stepmom. The whole idea of farm life was new to me and, at first, exciting. It was my stepmom's dream to live off the land, growing our own food, raising animals, and enjoying a simpler, self-sufficient lifestyle. Before we landed on this farm, we had tried living in smaller rural towns, but nothing ever worked out. We bounced from place to place, searching for the right fit. Sometimes the land wasn't good for farming, other times, the houses were in terrible shape. It felt like we spent years searching for the perfect spot. And just when we were about to give up, we found the farm. This place was a slice of heaven, with rolling hills and thick woods on one side, and a sparkling creek that flowed through the back. The property was massive and beautiful, dotted with wildflowers and shaded by towering trees. It even had an established asparagus field, which was a huge bonus. For my stepmom, it felt like a dream come true, and I couldn't help but feel excited about the move too. The house we moved into was old but charming, with a big porch that overlooked the fields. It had its quirks, creaky floors, and drafty windows, but there was something warm about it, as if it had witnessed countless stories over the years. My dad and stepmom were eager to dive into farm life, and it didn't take long for us to get started. Soon after we settled in, we began bringing animals to the farm. First came the chickens, then ducks, and even a few rabbits. The chickens and ducks roamed freely, and they seemed to love their new home, exploring the fields and splashing through puddles after a rainstorm. For the first few months, everything felt perfect. The animals were thriving, the land was fertile, and the entire place had this peaceful, almost magical vibe. There was no sense of danger, no reason to feel uneasy. We were living the dream, or so it seemed. But then, things began to take a strange turn. One sunny morning, two of our adult ducks went missing. At first, we shrugged it off. Ducks wander off sometimes, right? Maybe they had ventured too far and gotten lost. We thought they might have gone to explore a neighboring property or down to the creek. But as the days rolled on and there was still no sign of them, we started to feel worried. This wasn't like them. Ducks are creatures of habit, and they usually stuck close to the others. We searched high and low around the property, checked the woods, the creek, and even asked our neighbors if they'd seen our ducks. Nothing. No feathers. No signs of a struggle. It was as if they had just disappeared into thin air. Even though it felt strange, we didn't let it worry us too much at first. After all, we lived in the countryside, and things like this happen sometimes, right? Maybe a fox had gotten to them, or they wandered off further than we thought. Still, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was very wrong. It just felt off. A few weeks later, another strange incident made me start to question everything. It was late in the afternoon, and the sky was turning a deep, stormy gray. You know that feeling when the air is thick with tension, like a storm is just waiting to break? My dad, stepmom, and I were rushing to get the animals into their shelters before the storm hit. We didn't want any of them to be caught out in the open with the fast-approaching weather. As we hurried around the farm, my stepmom and I heard something, a faint quacking sound coming from the direction of the woods. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but unmistakably a duck. My heart raced. Could it be one of the ducks that had gone missing? Without thinking, we grabbed flashlights and headed toward the sound. The woods were about an acre away, and we had to cross the open field to reach them. My dad and brother, who had been working in the barn, saw us running and quickly followed, grabbing their rifles just in case. Out here in the countryside, you never know what kind of predators might be lurking in the shadows, especially with our ducks missing. As we reached the tree line at the edge of the property, the quacking abruptly stopped. My stepmom and I called out, hoping the ducks would return if they were nearby. My dad and brother headed toward the creek to check along the water, telling us to whistle if we saw or heard anything. As I moved cautiously along the side of the property, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the usual sounds of nature, the chirping birds and rustling leaves, had vanished. It was eerily quiet. The woods, which had always been full of life, were completely still. The only sound I could hear was the soft crunch of my boots on the dry grass. I kept walking, shining my flashlight into the growing darkness. The deeper I ventured into the woods, the darker it became. Soon, the only light guiding me was the beam from my flashlight. After a few minutes, I decided it was time to turn back. The storm was closing in, and I didn't want to get caught out in it. But just as I started to head back, I heard something, a soft whistle coming from deeper in the woods. I froze. The sound was faint, but definitely there. My first thought was that it was my brother, trying to get our attention from the other side of the property. I called out his name, but there was no response. My stepmom stood nearby, and I turned to her, asking, "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes wide with confusion. We both thought it had to be my brother. Who else could it be? We started moving toward the sound, but as we got closer, the whistling stopped, and the woods fell silent again. A few minutes later, my dad and brother emerged from the trees from the opposite direction. My dad looked at us, confused. "Why were you guys whistling?" he asked, catching his breath. "We weren't," I replied, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. "We thought it was you." My brother shook his head. "It wasn't me. I thought it was coming from your direction." We all stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. None of us had whistled, and yet we all heard it clear as day, coming from right in front of us. But there was no one there. No movement, no sound, just the fading light of the evening and the rumble of thunder in the distance. As we made our way back to the house, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was watching us. The woods seemed darker than before, and the wind rustled through the trees like whispers in the night. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I brushed it off, trying to focus on getting the animals safe before the storm hit. Once we were inside, we locked the doors and settled in for the night. The storm rolled in, bringing heavy rain and loud thunder. We sat together in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with stories and laughter, but I couldn't help thinking about the missing ducks and the strange whistling. The atmosphere in the house felt different too, charged with an unsettling energy that made it hard to relax. That night, as I lay in bed, sleep eluded me. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain pounding on the roof and the wind howling outside. My mind raced with thoughts of the ducks, the whistle, and the eerie quiet in the woods. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke to a strange noise outside. It sounded like rustling, but not from the wind or rain. I quickly got out of bed and peeked out the window. The sun was shining, and everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I grabbed my clothes and rushed downstairs to find my dad and stepmom already in the kitchen. "Did you hear that noise last night?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. My dad nodded, looking concerned. "Yeah, it was strange. Sounded like something was moving around out there. I thought it might be one of the animals, but they all seemed fine." My stepmom chimed in. "I heard it too. It kept me up for a while. I thought I was just being paranoid, but it felt like something was out there." We spent the morning checking on the animals and tending to the farm, but the feeling of unease lingered. As the day wore on, I found myself drawn to the woods. I wanted to see if I could find any clues about the missing ducks. My dad noticed my restless energy and offered to come with me. "Let's take a look together," he said. "Maybe we'll find something." As we walked toward the woods, the bright sunshine didn't ease the tension in my chest. I scanned the ground for tracks or feathers, but there was nothing, just the same dry grass and fallen leaves. My dad and I ventured deeper, the trees growing thicker and the shadows longer. Suddenly, I stopped in my tracks. There, just ahead, was a small clearing. In the middle of it was a large, dark shape. My heart raced as we approached, and I could see it was a pile of branches and leaves. But something about it felt wrong. It looked out of place, like it had been intentionally arranged. "What do you think that is?" I whispered to my dad. "I'm not sure," he replied, his brow furrowing. "It looks like someone has been here." Just then, a loud rustling came from behind us, and we both jumped, spinning around. But there was nothing there, just the trees swaying in the winds. We exchanged uneasy glances. "Maybe we should head back," I suggested, feeling a chill run down my spine. The forest suddenly felt claustrophobic, as if it were closing in on us. "Yeah, let's go," my dad agreed. As we made our way back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed alive, the branches reaching out like fingers, the shadows flickering in and out of view. When we finally reached the porch, I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. That evening, my family gathered around the dinner table, but the atmosphere was heavy with silence. The unease from the day hung over us like a thick fog. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the food, but my stepmom suddenly spoke up. "Has anyone else felt like something's off around here? Since we moved in, I've had this strange feeling that we're not alone." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. I had been feeling it too, but hearing her say it made it all the more real. My dad nodded slowly. "I've sensed it as well. It's hard to explain, but it feels like there's something watching us." My brother, usually the skeptic, chimed in. "Maybe it's just our imaginations. The farm is different, and we've had a lot of change lately. It's natural to feel uneasy." But I could see the worry in their faces, the way they avoided each other's gazes. After dinner, we all retreated to our separate corners of the house, the tension still thick in the air. Later that night, I lay in bed again, unable to sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of the woods, the missing ducks, and that strange whistling. The storm had passed, but the silence felt heavy. I rolled over, staring at the dark ceiling, when suddenly I heard it again, a faint whistle coming from outside. My heart pounded in my chest. Was it my imagination? I sat up, straining to listen. There it was again, clear as day. The whistle echoed through the quiet night, and I felt a rush of fear. I couldn't ignore it this time. I slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hallway, trying not to wake anyone. My heart raced as I reached the front door, holding my breath. I slowly opened it and stepped outside, the cool night air hitting my face. The moon hung high in the sky, casting shadows across the yard. I scanned the darkness, searching for any sign of movement. The woods loomed in front of me, a dark wall of trees, but I couldn't see anything. Yet the whistling continued, faint but clear. I called out into the darkness. "Hello, is anyone there?" My voice felt small and fragile in the vastness of the night. Silence answered me. The whistling stopped, and for a moment, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. But then, I noticed something just beyond the tree line, a flicker of light. It was brief, like a firefly, but it seemed to pulse in the darkness. My curiosity piqued. I stepped closer, but my instinct screamed at me to turn back. Before I could think twice, I felt a sudden chill sweep through the air, and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Something was very wrong. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, and just as I turned to head back to the house, I heard it again, a loud rustling in the woods, like something moving through the underbrush. Panic surged through me, and I sprinted back inside, slamming the door shut. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, but I knew I wasn't alone out there. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that we needed to leave the farm. It was supposed to be our dream, but something was very wrong. I confided in my dad and stepmom, sharing everything that had happened, but they were hesitant to act. They loved the farm and were convinced that we could make it work, that the strange occurrences were just coincidences. But as the days turned into weeks, the unease only grew. The missing ducks were never found, and I began to notice other things, shadows flitting between the trees, whispers that seemed to echo from the woods at night, and an unsettling feeling that followed me wherever I went. The world around us felt like it was shifting, turning into something unrecognizable. One afternoon, I was out in the asparagus field, pulling weeds when I heard laughter. It was distant but bright, like children playing. I looked around, expecting to see my brother or a neighbor, but there was no one. The field was empty, and the laughter faded away. I shivered, a sense of dread washing over me. That night, I could barely sleep. The laughter echoed in my mind, mixing with the whistling and rustling from the woods. It felt like the farm was alive, and not in a good way. My family continued to brush off my concerns, but I could see the worry in their eyes too. They were starting to feel it, even if they wouldn't admit it. Finally, one evening, after another day filled with strange happenings, I gathered my courage and decided to confront whatever was out there. I told my family that I needed to go back to the woods. My stepmom looked worried, but my dad agreed to come with me. "If you're feeling uneasy, we'll face it together," he said, determination in his voice. As we approached the woods, the air felt heavy, and the shadows stretched longer as the sun dipped below the horizon. I could hear the faint rustling of leaves and the distant sound of water flowing from the creek. The atmosphere was thick with tension, but I pushed forward, needing answers. When we reached the tree line, I took a deep breath and called out into the woods. "If anyone is there, show yourself." My voice echoed back at me, but nothing happened. My dad stood beside me, gripping his flashlight tightly. We stepped into the woods, the shadows swallowing us whole. The further we went, the more the world around us seemed to change. The familiar sounds of nature faded, replaced by an unsettling silence. It felt as though we had crossed into another realm. Suddenly, I saw a flicker of light, just like before, but this time it was brighter and seemed to dance between the trees. My heart raced as I turned to my dad. "Do you see that?" I whispered. He nodded, eyes wide with disbelief. "Let's go check it out." As we approached the light, a strange sensation washed over me, like an invisible force pulling me closer. But with every step, a sense of dread built in my chest. We reached the clearing where the dark shape had been before, but now it was gone, replaced by a soft, glowing orb hovering in the air. "Stay close," my dad said, stepping in front of me. I could feel the energy around us shifting, crackling with anticipation. Then, without warning, the orb flickered and vanished, plunging us into darkness. I felt a chill run down my spine as I glanced around, panic setting in. "What just happened?" I whispered. Just then, a low growl echoed from the shadows, and I froze. It was deep and menacing, unlike anything I had ever heard. My dad pulled me close, his grip tight as we scanned the darkness. The growl grew louder, and I could feel the air grow colder. In that moment, all the unease I had felt for weeks came crashing down. We were not alone. Something was out there, watching us, waiting. I turned to my dad, fear etched on my face. "We need to get out of here." We turned to leave, but before we could take a step, the growling stopped, replaced by a soft whispering. It was incomprehensible at first, but then I realized it sounded like the laughter I had heard in the field. It echoed around us, swirling in the darkness, wrapping around us like a cloak. "Run!" my dad shouted, and we took off back through the woods, branches snapping under our feet. The laughter grew louder, swirling around us, and I felt a cold breeze rush past me, chilling me to the bone. As we burst back into the open field, the laughter faded, and we stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath. We turned to look back at the woods, heart pounding. The trees stood silently, as if nothing had happened. My dad and I exchanged bewildered glances, and I could see the fear in his eyes. "We need to leave this place," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't know what's out there, but it's not safe." That night, we packed our things, ready to leave the farm behind. The dream had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was lurking in the woods had claimed our ducks, and maybe something more. As we drove away, I glanced back at the farm, now just a silhouette against the moonlight. I felt a mix of sadness and relief, knowing we were leaving behind a place that once felt like home. But as we drove into the night, I knew I would carry the memories of the farm and the whispers of the woods with me forever. The experiences haunted me, echoing in my mind. I wondered if we would ever truly escape what had happened there. The laughter, the whispers, and the shadows lingered, a reminder of the strange occurrences that had transformed our lives. It was a tale I would never forget, and one that would stay with me as a chilling part of my story, forever tied to the dark woods and the mysteries they held. We searched for a while longer, but with the storm coming in fast, we gave up and headed back to the house. That uneasy feeling stayed with me, though. The ducks were still missing, and now there was this strange whistling. It didn't add up. A week later, something else happened, and this time, I wasn't there to see it, but my brother and sister were. It was around 8 p.m., and although it was summer, a heavy storm was rolling in, and the sky was quickly growing dark. My brother and sister were outside in the yard, watching the clouds gather, when they saw something strange near the back of the property. About an acre away, near the fence line, they spotted a man crouching down. He was dressed all in white, almost blending in with the overcast sky. At first, they thought it was just a neighbor, maybe someone who had wandered onto the property by mistake. But as they watched, the man didn't move. He just crouched there, completely still, almost like he was hiding. My brother, always protective, grabbed his rifle and fired a warning shot into the air, shouting for the man to leave. The figure stood up slowly, almost too slowly, and then turned and ran toward the woods. But as he ran, my sister noticed something strange. He seemed to glow. She said it was like he had some kind of light around him, even though it was getting dark and there was no source of light nearby. The man disappeared into the trees, and just like that, he was gone. When they told me about it later, a chill ran down my spine. There was something so unsettling about the way the man had appeared and disappeared so suddenly. And the fact that my sister saw him glowing like he wasn't fully real made it even creepier. After that, my parents became a lot more cautious. They didn't want us going into the woods anymore, and we stopped letting the animals roam freely around the property. The disappearances of the ducks, the strange whistling, and now this glowing figure, it all felt connected, but we couldn't explain how or why. As time went on, the strange events on the farm became more of a memory. Life returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. But every now and then, when I think back to that summer, I wonder if we ever really knew what was lurking in those woods. There's a part of me that believes we weren't alone out there, that something was watching us, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. We never figured out what it was, but sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside, I still think about that eerie whistle echoing through the trees. And I wonder, will it ever come back?